welcome to the Sins of Chicago Nickelodeons. Spicy, right? All right, so what we're going to do this evening on our virtual tour is to walk through Chicago's Uptown neighborhood to the former Lakeside Theater. And as we do this, we're going to make 3 stops along the way. And as we do that, we're going to learn about Nickelodeons, or also they were called cheap theaters. And we're going to hear why some Chicagoans claimed that these cheap nickel movie houses would lure you into a life of sin. You being women, immigrants, and working class folks. All right, so those are our goals for this evening. If you're new, I'm Kelly. I run Chicago Movie Tours. My goal is that right there, which is to help you discover Chicago through film. So we are definitely going to do that by moving all around the Uptown neighborhood this evening. So if you're interested in more film and Chicago related events, check out chicagomovietours.com after tonight's virtual tour, or follow along on social media at Shy Movie Tours. All right. Hi, Peter. How's it going? Okay, so let us get started then with our virtual tour, and we're going to do this as we usually do with these programs, which is to situate ourselves in relationship to downtown Chicago, or the Loop area. So we are going to make our way north of the city today as we head to the Uptown neighborhood. And let's get a little bit closer look at the streets that we're going to be traversing together this evening, so you can see how far we are above the primary area, or the downtown area of Chicago. So let's get a little closer look at this area. So here we're going to start at the Uptown Theater. That will be our first stop this evening. And then we're going to make our way just a short way down the street and look at the Bridgeview Bank building. And then we're going to turn left on Lawrence Avenue, and we're going to head to our third stop, which is the Aragon Ballroom. And then we'll make our final destination at the former Lakeside Theater. And along the way here, we're going to talk about Nickelodeons, or cheap theaters, and the sins that apparently occurred within them. All right, so we'll start with stop number 1. Right in front of the Uptown Theater. So here we are. This was a huge movie palace built in 1925, seating nearly 4,500 people. It is still the largest remaining movie palace in Chicago. So I don't really have a person standing next to the front doors, but hopefully you can get an idea just with that car going past how large this theater is and of course was. But you can see the interior of this theater featured prominently in a few movies, actually. I've picked one movie and one television show for us to look at this evening. So we'll start with Chicago PD, a relatively recent episode of Chicago PD. I think it was season 6. We'll look at that, and then we'll also look at it in a quick scene from the 1991 movie Backdraft. So here is a look inside the Uptown Theater in Chicago PD. Get a little bit of a glimpse there of how it would have looked in its glory with all of this ornate architectural design that is there. So there's Chicago PD. Let's get a quick peek inside the auditorium portion of the theater. More of that in Backdraft. So here is a scene from Backdraft. A really memorable scene at that, right? So here you're getting to see the breadth of the auditorium there, much more of the theater space than you did in the Chicago PD episode. You can see a little bit of the balcony too, and some more architectural elements that might match the ones that we saw in Chicago PD. All right, so the Uptown Theater itself has been closed since 1981, but obviously, as we've already seen thus far on our virtual tour, it has been used in movies and television shows since that closing date of 1981. And the hope is that this massive theater will be restored to its former glory at a cost of, as you can see there to my left, about $75 million. So, and if you squint really closely, you can probably make out that this article from the Chicago Tribune is from June of 2018, and nothing has been done yet to help restore the Uptown Theater. And the plans, I think, fell through in 2021 a lot because of the pandemic itself. But there is a group that is pretty active on Facebook and elsewhere called Friends of the Uptown. And if you are interested in knowing kind of when this theater is expected to return to its former glory, that's who you want to keep up with, is Friends of the Uptown Theater. All right, so there's our first stop at the Uptown. We'll get one more look at it here and the size of it. And then we'll keep walking to the left, and we're going to head to our second stop, which is the Bridgeview Bank Building. And as we do this, we're going to turn left onto Lawrence Avenue. There's a little sign there for Uptown Neighborhood on a rather dreary day, actually, that I'm filming this. Directly across the street from where we are is also a spot that's used quite often in film, which is the Green Mill Tavern. But we're looking here at this building that's coming up on our left, which is this kind of green and cream color building. This is the Bridgeview Bank Building. And the initial section of it, so these first 8 floors that we're going to see, are built in the mid-1920s. Then as my camera tilts all the way up, you'll see 4 more stories in addition to the 8 that are currently there. And those were, here you go, there's 4 more way up there. And then those were built 4 years later, so in 1928. Kind of hard to tell from the angle that we're at here, but this is a pretty uniquely shaped building. It's triangular shaped, but it's very rounded at the corner where that Starbucks is on Broadway and Lawrence Avenue. And it obviously does, or did, serve as a bank for many years, the Bridgeview Bank Building, but now it is a mixed-use apartment and office complex that is, I believe, called Teller House now. So several apartment buildings in these floors, these 8 stories there. All right, so there's our Bridgeview Bank Building, and the reason I'm pointing out this building, because it's of interest to us at Chicago Movie Tours, is that there are movies and TV shows that are filmed inside the lobby of this building. So I have 2 screenshots for you here on the screen. We have at the top Public Enemies, which is that Johnny Depp gangster movie I've talked a little bit about before. And then at the bottom you have season 4 of the TV series Fargo, which is on FX. And that's Chris Rock's character, I believe, right in the center going up those stairs. So both of these are filmed inside the Bridgeview Bank Building. Notice also both of these are shot from very low angles, which is not only showcasing the gangsters' authority as they're marching into these buildings and pulling guns and doing what gangsters do, but the low angle is also showing us this ornate and brightly colored ceiling of the Bridgeview Bank Building. This is the former grand banking floor. So quite lovely to look at when you go in there. So you have those cinematographers knowing exactly how to get that ceiling captured in those shots in both Public Enemies and Fargo. All right, so let's keep walking here. We're going to make our way across Lawrence Avenue, or down Lawrence Avenue, I should say, and we're going to head to our third stop, which is the Aragon Ballroom. There's our map there. So you can see the Aragon, the sign for it there on the left-hand side of your screen, just under the CTA red line. And as we make our way underneath here, let's go ahead and start that discussion of Nickelodeons, or cheap theaters, as they were sometimes called during the early part of cinema's history. So cheap theaters, they're called nickel theaters, they're called 5-cent theaters, they are called Nickelodeons, they're called nickel dumps, and some newspapers referred to them as vicious theaters. So these Nickelodeons had lots of names attached to them. So nickel movie theaters, the reason that they are called this first, and you can probably guess why, is that the price for going into one of these facilities or these buildings was 5 cents, as you can see with the 2 arrows there pointing at the admission price, both to the side of the Nickelodeon storefront and to the left right there with one of the placards in the front. So they boasted these cheap prices of 5 cents admission, which means they were very popular with Chicago immigrants, or immigrants who had come to the Chicago area. Also very popular with working class citizens here in Chicago. People who did not have a lot of extra money or maybe even the interest in going to see entertainment like opera or ballet and the like, right? So for these groups of people, the immigrants and the working class, Nickelodeons represented a few things. First off, a moment of pleasure away from the harsh working conditions in which they usually found themselves here in Chicago. Sunday was often the only day that these people had off, and so Sunday they would use to frequent these Nickelodeons. Secondly, Nickelodeons and these cheap theaters were very much opportunities for community, for women to engage with other women, for women to look for men, and vice versa. So they're not only cheap, of course, they not only provide community, but they're also very accessible. Let me put some figures for you on screen really quickly. So 1907, we're talking about Chicago here. There were roughly 150 cheap theaters or Nickelodeons in the Chicago area. By the next year at that same time, it was double that, 300. So it only took a year to double the accessibility of these theaters. And in Chicago, the daily attendance at these theaters was roughly 200,000 people per day. Now, nationwide, that would have been about 2 million. So Chicago is doing really well as far as filling these theaters and people coming in and paying their nickel to see these movies. And immigrants, like the ones that you have on the right-hand side of your screen here, remember, these people are speaking very little to no English. They had very little money for other entertainment forms. And remember, also, immigrants like this Albanian woman here did not need to speak English to watch a silent movie. So she can go in there and watch Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin or whoever comes before them and laugh at them stepping on a banana peel or slipping on a banana peel, because these silent films did not require that you know English. It reaches all walks of life, for example. So it's when sound comes into play in the 1920s, late 1920s, that gets a little bit disrupted, but that's for another tour. All right, we've made it underneath the CTA's red line where we left off a moment ago. Our third stop over there on the left-hand side of your screen is coming into view, the Aragon Ballroom. This building here dates from 1926. It's in the Moorish style of architecture. You see a lot of very Middle Eastern looking architectural elements there on the ballroom itself. If you're familiar with Chicago's radio station or now TV station, WGN, that broadcast from the Aragon Ballroom at one point during its history. I've mentioned ballroom, the Aragon Ballroom. It was regular dancing here up until about the early 1960s, and then this building started functioning as various other things, like a roller skating rink, for example, when that was quite popular. It has also been a boxing venue, and most recently, and I think as it still is today, it's a concert venue. And the list of people who have come in here and performed quite large. Muddy Waters, for example, Styx, REO Speedwagon, Green Day are some of the ones that I've seen listed on the website there. So here's one more look at the Aragon Ballroom before we head to our fourth stop. But again, along the way, we need to talk more about the cheap theaters so we have a good history of that background. So let's keep working our way down Lawrence Avenue here, say goodbye to the Aragon Ballroom, and we are going to walk a good distance here together down to Sheridan Road, make a right there, and we'll find ourselves in front of the former Lakeside Theater. So back to the cheap theaters though, as we are walking down this way. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the success of these cheap theaters was very heavily linked to a massive influx of immigrants into Chicago in the early part of the 20th century. And keep in mind, by 1910, immigrants made up 36% of Chicago's population. So a huge number there. And while working class and immigrant Chicagoans like these really loved these cheap theaters or Nickelodeons, you have people like these on the right-hand side of your screen, middle class Chicagoans. They detested these cheap theaters. They also did not like what the theaters were showing, which they thought were immoral and indecent images. Anything suggestive is dangerous to the community. thinking of things like murder or any other crimes like that, robbery, burglary, and of course, sex. All big no-nos for the middle-class Chicagoans. Here's, for example, is an intermission card from cinema's early days. So this is what would play, in between films. So you can see the text there that says, the next part will follow at once. But look at the way that the woman is positioned on the card itself, which would have been huge on a screen, right? You have this sexy woman there looking directly at you, the viewer, in a rather flirty way, we might add. She's showing her leg, which is a lot of leg for 1907, most likely. And she's relatively scantily clad on top, showing a lot of arms and shoulders and that sort of thing. So even the intermission cards were a little suggestive, too much so for several of these middle-class Chicagoans. So they didn't care for what was happening, what the theaters were showing on screen, which is, these indecent images and intermission cards, but they also just did not like the theater's interior makeup and the way that these theaters were designed. So here is an example of one of the first, if not the first, Nickelodeon in the US. But you can see here by this image that these theaters were very tight. The seats were extremely close together. They were quite crowded. And most of the ones in Chicago set no more than 299 people. If it goes to over 300, that's a different classification of building and theater, so there has to be some other insurance and other situations business-wise that have to happen for that. So they set between 100 to 299 people. There were very dark rooms. They had a stage, which you can see a little bit there in the image next to me. Many of them were just made up of folding chairs or any other kind of chairs that people could drag in there and put in rows. Most of the time there was a piano. Sometimes there was a lecturer. Sometimes there was a person coming in singing at the Nickelodeons during intermissions or maybe over the images themselves. You also had bouncers that were consistently patrolling up and down the aisles, asking men and women to remove their hats, which is something that obviously people did not like to do. Because if you're hiring a bouncer to do that, it's something that people are continually doing, right? And how one critic describes the Nickelodeons at the time is this right here. Its walls are painted red. Its seats are ordinary kitchen chairs, not fastened to the ground. The auditorium is 1 story high, 25 feet wide, and about 70 feet deep. Last year or the year before, it was probably a secondhand clothes shop, a pawn shop, or a cigar store. So because these theaters are necessarily so dark to show these movies, it was an added attraction to younger people. And the Chicago Tribune reports about some of the girls who frequent these Nickelodeons. Girls are found talking with men of mature years, the journalist writes, whom they could not have met before going to the theater. So let's look at this image together here, or this painting, I should say. You can see some of the characteristics that I've been reciting to you in this with regard to Nickelodeons. Let me try that again. You can see some of the characteristics of Nickelodeons that we've been talking about in this painting here from 1907 by John Sloan, and the name of the painting is 5 Cents. So we have the interior of a Nickelodeon represented here in his painting. You can see that it's relatively dark, very cramped. Every seat, it seems, is full there. It's crowded. It's very well attended. There are just rows and rows of patrons here in this darkened space before a movie screen. You have very clearly on the movie screen a man and a woman in this embrace. They're kissing, and they show out very nicely against the rest of this darkened space with their white clothes and the light that is shining on them. If you look right in the middle of the screen, you have a woman looking directly back at you as if she is aware she's being watched by you, the viewer there. And if you look a little bit further behind her, you can also see different ethnicities, different races, different genders, right? All of these mixed up together, represented, all enjoying the film. So in 1907, reformers in Chicago, again, like those middle-class Chicagoans I showed earlier, they were trying to regulate these cheap theaters, and Chicago was the very first city in the U.S. to do this. So let's look at some headlines together here. On the left, we have traces crime to nickel theater. On the right, we have would suppress vicious theaters. And then at the bottom, you have the penny arcade, and the cheap theater has a hold on moving picture shows on the children. So basically what these articles and many others like this are telling us is that these middle-class Chicagoans singled out these small, cheap movie houses, claiming that these movies that were shown within them were a technology that lured innocent women, innocent children, and immigrants into a life of sin. So for these people, these reformers, the cheap theaters represented a means of control, right? A means to control, again, young immigrants, young women, and young working class people. And I'm going to emphasize the word young there because during this time when these Nickelodeons were at their height, so between 1905 to 1908, give or take, 40% of the population in Chicago was under the age of 20. So they really wanted to have a means to control the younger population. And they would report in newspapers quotes like this, that these theaters cause more juvenile crime than all of the other bad influences put together. These theaters are contaminating the tender minds of the children. Imaginations are being debauched. So newspapers were full of this kind of stuff where you have these people trying to close down these theaters. All right, so let's keep making our way down Lawrence Avenue. We're going to turn right on Sheridan, and I'll tell you a couple of stories as we do so. So for example, there was a 15-year-old girl who allegedly ran away from home with the manager of one of these nickel theaters on Halsted Street after she visited his theater over and over and over because she was so interested in watching scenes of love and passion. So those movies made her do it, basically. And there's another story as we get to the edge of the street here, about a 14-year-old boy from a good family, the newspaper reports, who watched way too many crime movies at another Chicago theater on Halsted. One night, he went home, he secured his father's gun, crept into an alleyway, and pointed the gun at the first passerby that came past him and said, just like a movie character, hands up, move, and I will kill you. So you have stories like this, and then you have judges in Chicago who are saying they could trace every single juvenile crime in the courtroom to cheap movie houses. Now, as we're making our way over here to this last stop, I should point out that most of these cheap theater managers were immigrants and often Jewish. So there's a significant amount of racism and xenophobia attached to these accusations, which is, as my camera turns to the right here, bringing us to Uptown's Lakeside Theater, the former Lakeside Theater. So there it is. It's called Alternatives now, but hopefully you can see that this was very much once a theater with a marquee out front. So the Lakeside Theater opened September the 4th of 1915 by the Asher Brothers Theater chain. Here is its announcement. You can see on the left, Asher's Lake Theater on Sheridan Road, the initial opening at 6:30 p.m. So this theater set about 1,000 people. It was not a cheap theater. It was not a Nickelodeon. In fact, it sold tickets around 17 cents a person, which is considerably more than what cheap theaters by 1915 were raising their prices to, which was about 10 cents. So in the fall of 1918, the Asher Brothers sell the Lakeside Theater in Chicago's Uptown neighborhood, where we've been walking around, to another chain called Lubliner and Trends. You can see that on the left in the highlighted text there. So the Asher Brothers sell to these two guys, and that's fine. You know, theater sales happened all the time in this early days of cinema. But what this article is telling us is that with this shift in management, there was some concern. So look at underneath the headline. It says, report that the Lakeside Theater, will be run as a cheap house is denied. So what this article is telling us then is that with this shift in management from the Asher Brothers to Lubliner and Trends, there was a growing fear in this community that the Lakeside, which received a lot of patronage from the elite on Chicago's North Side, would be run as a cheap movie house. Well, why would there be so much fear about this? And there really are two reasons, both of which are movie theaters. So let's start with the Pantheon Theater. The Pantheon Theater there to my left had recently opened just down the street from the Lakeside in the Uptown neighborhood, September 1918 in fact. And this theater cost more than $500,000 in 1918 to build. Set about 3,000 people, so this is a pretty large theater. It was in fact the largest in the area in the Uptown neighborhood until the Uptown, our first stop, opened in 1925. So this theater, the Pantheon, charged 22 cents a ticket, very much attracting the elite Chicagoans who could afford to pay that price. So the second reason that people were fearing that this Lakeside Theater might become a cheap theater is the second theater is the Riviera. So the Riviera opens a month later from the Pantheon, also down the street, set about 2,600. So again, a relatively large theater here, also costing more than $500,000 to build, very much attracting these elite customers as well. The Riviera is charging 33 cents a ticket. So the new owners of the Lakeside assured the public in this article here that it would not be run as a cheap theater. They would continue to charge 17 cents a ticket, as opposed to these rumors that they'd be charging only 12 cents, thus lowering the quality of its shows. So again, this is 1918. By the early 1930s, this theater that we're heading toward right now did actually serve the purpose its new owners feared. It was eventually run as a discount or cheap house. So it did, unfortunately, kind of their wish that they did not want came true. And the theater closed in the mid-1960s. You can see it here around that time period, with the marquee intact and obviously a triple horror feature showing there on the far right hand side of your screen. But now it houses a youth center called Alternatives, and it empowers young Chicagoans between the ages of say 10 and 20-ish to build safer communities through different programs that they offer and health services. And you can see these goals on the mosaic tile work that now is attached to the former Lakeside Theater. You see explore, strength, let's see if we get down a little bit further. All of this quite lovely in person actually to check out. You can see strength, love over there to the left, a little bit of the top of the building. So you can see some of the architectural elements are still very much intact as it would have looked as a theater itself. Quite shiny whenever it's sunny, but this day is not particularly sunny. Mentor, share, other words I'm looking for, inspire, trust, create, love. There's where the marquee would have been, and you can still see the holes where the light bulbs would have been fastened in all around the top part of that section of the former marquee. So there you go. You still have the Lakeside Theater just functioning as something else altogether. All right, so we've started at the Uptown Theater, learned a little bit about its history and where it's used in Backdraft and Chicago PD, made our way to the Bridgeview Bank building where we learned a little bit more about that building as well as its use in Fargo and Public Enemies, and then we headed to the Aragon Ballroom, and finally we made our way, as promised, to the Lakeside Theater. And all along the way, hopefully you learned something new about Chicago Nickelodeons or cheap theaters. So thanks very much for joining me for the sins of Chicago Nickelodeons.